organized by the Punta del Este Group. My name is Alejandro Jara. I am joining you directly from Santiago, Chile today.
Oh.
The Punta del Este Group is a Latin American independent network. It's a think tank, if you will, that aims to create awareness and encourage discussion and analysis of the multilateral trading system, particularly in times of crisis and need of reform, as we all aware. Just a matter of housekeeping, we're going to have a presentation by Jesus SEADE, following which there will be a question and answer. And any questions you may have, please do it through the chat and address them to Fernando de Mateo. Thank you very much. So I'd like to introduce Jesus here. He's a chemical engineer. Now there's a slight resemblance to Roberto Acevedo, who was an electric engineer, as we all know.
I didn't know that.
So that's a good omen. He's also an economist. He has a PhD.
Don't push that. Don't push that.
He's a Mexican citizen. He also has Lebanese citizenship. He was ambassador to the GATT early 90s when I met Jesus. And then he became Deputy Director General under Peter Sutherland.
Yeah.
So he has wide experience in the system. He's also held important responsibilities in both the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. More recently, he was chief negotiator to the new NAFTA agreement. I still don't know how to call it, but anyway, sorry about that. And currently he is Undersecretary for North American Affairs at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Mexico. He also has wide academic experience in Hong Kong and China and in Warwick University and elsewhere. So having said that, I'd like to welcome you, Jesus, once more. Thank you for joining us. And I'll give you the floor for some 50 minutes for you to make a presentation, and particularly for you to give us your vision on how to restore trust and the functioning of the WTO, and what would be your message to Latin American countries. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alejandro, and thank you very much, all of you members of the Punta del Este Group. Fernando, thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to join you and a great pleasure to see you again, each of you. Well, I don't have to say that the WTO is in a time crisis. 26 years of minimal achievements in negotiations, some important but very narrow. As a result of a lack of... Sorry? You cannot hear me?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
We can hear you.
As a result of the lack of negotiations in 26 years, which is a huge amount of time, in this age where changes happen so quickly, we don't have electronic trade in the agreements. China was not part of the system when they were negotiated, nor was Russia, Vietnam, so many countries. So very many changes. And the lack of development of the rules, the lack of engagement among countries in negotiations, which was always the heart of the system in the previous life as GATT, has meant, as Lighthizer has correctly said, I think, has meant that all the weight of adjustment to the new realities has been on the dispute settlement system, and the dispute settlement system in different has found it overbearing, and now we have the appellate body out of circulation, and that is really affecting in a direct way maybe the heart of what we achieved when creating WTO, the dispute settlement system. So those two elements represent major crises. On top of that comes the terrible relationship between the United States and China, which makes a lot of noise for all the countries in the world. And then on top of all that comes the pandemic. And so with all that, we do need very much an urgent action to come out of the hole. And for that, we don't have favorable winds, but we don't have bright stars aligning up in the sky, but we have black stars aligning equally. So bad factors that should bring all our governments to action, which is all the multifaceted crisis that I described, combined with the fact that the ministerial conference, which is the main organ where decisions are supposed to be taken, will now be taking place with a huge delay, not 2 years as normal, not 3 years, but now 4 years. So urgent kind of pent-up pressure to take action. Acevedo did the only thing he could do, and I respect him very much for that, which was to quit 1 year early, because the alternative was to stay and to lead the conference where a new beginning would be launched, hopefully, and at which he would not be part of that new beginning. He would be saying goodbye. So instead of that, he's leaving. But so all those factors create pressure upon pressure. And so it is of the utmost importance that the impasse that members have found in appointing an acting director general should not be repeated with the appointment of a director general. I was hoping initially that the new person might be in place for the 1st of September. I think that's what Ambassador Walker was aiming at. Now it's likely to be 1st December, maybe. So we cannot delay it anymore. And if it is November instead of December, so much the better. Anyway, so for that to happen, the countries need to appoint a new director general. And what kind of director general? Well, let me, to save time, subsuming the profile of what we think I need with the offer that I represent. So I will make 3 points of what I offer, and I believe that those 3 points respond to 3 distinct needs that we have, or factors that should be given a lot of weight. The first one is that, yes, I am a proud Mexican, I am a proud Latin American, and I really very much mean that. My honeymoon, when people were not traveling north to south anywhere, if you travel was to the United States or to Europe, my honeymoon was in South America, 2 unforgettable months in South America, all of South America. And I've always been a great fan. A lot of my professional life has been spent on South America. One of my points of pride was to create the most distinguished economic society in Latin America, joining forces with distinguished economists from Brazil and the distinguished economists from Argentina. And we created the Econometric Society of Latin America, of which I was a co-chairman the first 3 years, and a chairman of one of the conferences. I'm generally speaking a very devoted Latin American, but at the same time, I am very much a citizen of the world. I have lived extended periods, more than 5 years, more than 8 years, in England, Switzerland, of course, Mexico, United States, Hong Kong, and I have lived for a year or 2 in France, in People's Republic of China. I have earned a salary for several months in Canada, advising on corporate tax reform, in Brazil. So, and then my substantive work from the World Bank, WTO, and IMF was very much on Arab countries, Eastern Europe, Latin America, of course, Africa a lot. So I am very much a citizen of the world. And I find myself completely at home talking to an Australian government officer in Australia, or a Chinese one in China, or a Finnish in Finland, or a Chilean in Chile. The world is my home, very much culturally speaking. I feel very comfortable. I have worked with them, with you, and on them and in them very much. So I am known. And I offer a forceful director general that will be close to everybody, but not too close to anybody. That's the first thing that we need, or at least I offer. The second is a forceful negotiator. People speak of a political level. Well, politics can mean many things, can mean electoral politics, whatever. What we need is interaction at the highest level. And I have negotiated lots of things with heads of government, from the IMF in particular, but also from WTO and in other capacities. And with ministers, since I was 30 or so, I began to be involved in issues. I have a long established career of functioning at the top level, very much in difficult negotiations, not only creation of WTO, that you will remember was extremely difficult, not only the new negotiation with the United States, that I assure you was extremely difficult, but also, for example, being the head man at the IMF, negotiating financial crisis support for Brazil, Argentina, and Turkey, as well as debt forgiveness for 15 African countries. All those took me to meetings with heads of government in G7 countries and with ministers all over the place. So I am a very seasoned negotiator, and I don't shrink talking to anybody. I may not always win a discussion, that's impossible, but I don't shrink. I can be gentle, respectful, but effective. That's the second thing you need. And the third one, I believe, is often minimized because some people have candidates that do not meet this criterion. But it is fundamental to have enough depth in trade negotiations, in the World Trade Organization world, and not just WTO, but the world of trade agreements. The agreement that I just negotiated is very relevant. There are lots of things that are adaptations that you can, again, bring to mind when you are in a heavy discussion. Without this depth in trade, the first discussion that I tried to assist and create between Phil Hogan and Bob Lighthizer, they begin to discuss the appellate body or subsidies of this kind or the other. And after 10 seconds, without that depth, I will be lost. And I will be looking at my cell phone and they will be discussing by themselves. If you want a DG that really is part of the process and helps to lead the WTO out, you need a forceful hand that can talk to everybody and that knows what he's talking about, so as to engage in discussion. And that's what I plan to do with your support, my friends from all over Latin America and elsewhere, I believe. Thank you very much. I give it back to you. I hope I didn't take too long.
Thank you very much, Jesus. Presentation was very good, very succinct. I think that you have given us the breadth of your experience. And I think in doing so, I think you have indicated the qualities that you would bring to the position of Director General. Now, we have a few questions and I'll take a few of them. If you can elaborate a bit more in terms of what, in your view, are the necessary reforms that the WTO needs and how to conduct and guide these reforms. What kind of process do you envisage? And in that context, what do you see as the role of the Director General and of the Secretariat, if you can elaborate on that? Over to you.
Well, first thing I have to say, because my passion and my energy in suggesting that I will try to generate discussions and so on might be misinterpreted as saying, oh, this guy is planning to bring his points of view to a member-driven organization. The first thing I have to say is that I was very much on that side. I've been a country negotiator very much, and I know what that means. Decisions are taken only by members, and even proposals are submitted only by members. What I intend to provide is a forceful, well-intended, honest broker who is an active honest broker, not a postal service connecting A to B, but an interlocutor that will generate discussion, will assist that discussion, will challenge in that discussion whenever I feel that a party, a minister in the fisheries negotiation or in the appellate body discussions, as long as I see that somebody is just procrastinating or grandstanding, which has happened a lot in all the 4 major negotiations on the way. I will respectfully say, Mr. Minister, this is what I understand you were saying 6 months ago and 3 months ago. So let's try to move forward, and perhaps you can address the points just made by your counterpart who spoke just before you. So I will be that kind of a director general, trying to move forward the discussions, having the ability, the skill to identify points of contact, to try to turn around positions, to define, to propose, to put on the table a new different formulation from what A is saying and B is saying that do not seem to click. And I will always try to find a formulation that brings them together, that gives A what he needs, B what he needs, but in a way that they cannot, they don't have to feel threatened or whatever it may be the case. So to be an active part in the negotiations, and I expect the Secretariat to be the same. The Secretary, of course, exercising a lot more self-control, but certainly being proactive in providing support. I would like to have a Secretariat, for example, going to a different subject. I believe the Secretariat is wonderful. I really think consists of a big bunch of, not very big, a bunch of very competent and dedicated people, but the way they are laid out, perhaps I would question. I get a feeling that we may have in the Secretariat a little too many captains and not enough soldiers. So I would have a flatter structure that might be more appropriate for giving support to delegations, meeting questions and doing analysis that they may request, having a secretariat that is more engaged with delegations. Also a secretariat that finds ways of stretching its resources and also getting more resources to expand our activities on technical assistance, training, all kinds of support assistance to the members. And I would also bring 2 innovations in those 2 fronts, particularly in technical assistance, 2 that I think are innovations. I'm not 100% sure how much of this is done, but I get a feeling that a lot more needs to be done, which are, 1, to have everybody in the Secretariat, pretty much every professional in the Secretariat, being engaged in this kind of activity. Whether you are in the agriculture division or in rules division or in whichever division, maybe 15–20% of your time will be involved in technical assistance missions to engage with members. And the other one is that I hope that a big fraction of the support we can lay out for members can come from member countries. So to work out leveraging our resources in the Secretariat with the resources of expertise from member countries. That's a very massively used practice in international financial organizations generally, all of them. And that's something that I think we need to do more. So if there's a mission on something or other being done to a particular country in Africa, Latin America, whatever, well, you may bring this German or this New Zealander or this Brazilian with you who is an expert. But back to what I was saying, it is an engaged participant in the negotiations, engaged participant in all the discussions, supporting members' movement forward, and being engaged with us. I will never be a DG in his office and says, these discussions are among members. If members want to have a private discussion, of course they can, they will. But I very much see myself as being part of this and leading and breaking walls so as to find ways to move forward. Maybe I will not start to talk about my priorities because that's part of the question, but only indirectly. So maybe we can discuss questions of agenda separately. So that's more or less the way that I see the role of the DG. All of this, I insist, within a careful awareness all the time that this is a member-driven organization. Decisions are for members. I will not be planting positions or pushing positions into countries. and nor making proposals, but floating ideas so that if a member likes them, the proposal will come from the members. That's the way I see it, Alejandro.
Thank you very much. When you say member-driven, reminds me of a comment that I heard Simon Evenet make some years ago, to say that judging by the performance, it seems that it's not member-driven because it's going nowhere, but rather member-controlled. Speaking of which,
member station, maybe the station, maybe member part.
Yeah, speaking of which, your comments on the role of the DG and Secretariat, I have two questions for you here. One from Simon. Had you been Director General when the coronavirus hit, what would you have done differently in leading the Secretariat? Could the WTO machinery have been used to greater effect? And to that, there's another related question, which is from Hector Torres. Could the Secretariat be more actively involved in fostering transparency? Over to you, Jesus.
Yeah, absolutely. On the first question, is very difficult. I mean, the crisis hit us very much by surprise. I mean, let's be realistic. Even when people began to know that there was a crisis in China, everybody was kind of assuming, oh, this is China. So if there was an error of preparation, it really belongs to the officers in charge of health issues in your countries and in our countries and all over the world, the rest of the world. So for trade people to be blamed for not having seen the pandemic arrive with all the energy it did in Europe and in the Americas would be a stretch. But so once it arrived, the priority was to save lives. And it had to be the priority to save lives. So people were taking measures right and left without much preparation, without almost any coordination between countries, just closing borders to prevent coming to quick agreements. I lived through it with the United States. So very quickly, I negotiated with the United States an agreement to accept economic and trade movements through the border to the largest extent possible, going through and defining which could go, which could not, and stopping a lot of the work of the productive sectors in the country internally. It was a very difficult process to do any better. Nevertheless, I guess that we could have had a more energetic effort at trying to enhance coordination. The kind of coordination that I tried to develop with our major trading partner, I think could have had some chance of being supported and generated more generally. It's perhaps easier to say what I would think the WTO needs to handle a possible pandemic in future. And to the extent possible, a version of the same should have been subsumed, acting quickly against time when the pandemic hit. And this is to be basically a market for coordination, not coordination between bureaucrats. That's very difficult. The world doesn't want to have a central planning office. And I don't see the WTO becoming a central planning office of closures and reopening with the pandemic. But when sectors close, they not only close activities in their country. The world today is characterized by huge sausages that cut across countries called extended international value chains. And when you cut or when you reopen next December or next June, whatever it will be, when you cut or when you reopen an activity, most of the time it is this section of an extended value chain. And so you really have to ask yourself, for example, when reopening and when closing is the flip side, will my producers in this sector have confidence that they will be able to import the minerals or the parts, the components that they will need, that they probably import from several sources, several countries, or maybe one predominantly or whatever. Are they confident? Will they be confident they can import that? And then whatever they produce, will they be confident that they can sell it downstream, or maybe downstream activities are not back to normal. So I believe that an intensive, energetic, WTO-centered process of exchanging plans on a voluntary basis, but not too voluntary. I would think of a framework that we devise and that you get into or not on a voluntary basis. But if you get into, it's a code of good conduct. And that code of good conduct tells you the speed and the kind of information you have to provide about closing or about opening, about plans to do so next month or 2 months hence, about changes in your plans. Nobody's going to keep you to your promise. You have changes because of health reasons, changes in your plans, to have this marketing information that we in the WTO will operationalize, will organize, and make it available to our member countries for them to make available to producers. So sectors by sector, producers will be able to read how their upstream and downstream in the value chain is looking. I think we could have done some of that, not a lot of that. We could also have done more on the persuasion and extracting kind of commitments to the extent possible on the fact that all this is temporary. Because there's been a lot of political statements about, oh, the pandemic has shown how unwise it is to depend on international extended value chains. The pandemic hits, and I suffer because I cannot import. I depend too much on that. So I should be producing all that at home. That's what we have been hearing from many sources. I think that's wrong and dangerous. Wrong and dangerous because it will deny our countries the benefits of trade. And trade is what has brought prosperity and peace to the world the last 75 years. Prosperity and peace. I really believe in open trade. Nevertheless, the pandemic showed that you have to have room for emergencies. So I would develop a code of conduct that tells us how we can switch onto the exceptional regime. The WTO, the GATT, before it have clauses allowing for action on national security or on health grounds when a country has an emergency. When you have Japan and you have a tsunami. But when everybody has an emergency, we don't know how to proceed. So we should develop a code of good conduct that generates the information exchanges that I was saying for the maximum benefit of our producers, and also good behavior commitments on temporariness, knowing that when the pandemic hits, you will have access to measures that you don't have to keep all the time. We may create commitments by countries not to close all their exports if they want to keep a good that they need, but to be sensitive to the needs of other countries. We have to negotiate all that. I don't think it was realistic to do a lot of that in this pandemic, but some of it, yes. The coordination part at least, and the commitments to not being protectionist. Nature of the measures.
Thank you.
There was another question. From
about transparency. What?
About transparency. Well, I think that transparency is very important, but has been a bit of a disappointment. I was in charge of the TPR, and I love the TPR. I think it's very important, but it's not enough, the TPR. It doesn't come with enough speed. I really believe that we need to develop commitments by members for the information that the Secretariat gathers. I believe it's every 6 months on trade measures should be more frequent, maybe 3 months. But on the other hand, we should create, to the extent possible, commitments for proactive provision of information measures. I believe that transparency is a major area that requires revisiting. It is part of the agreements, we have obligations, but there are much better things that we can do. I'm talking about trade transparency. We can also have transparency in other areas on investment measures, not measures as we define them at home, but measures, mechanisms for approval and so on, even if not related to trade. I think we need to have more of a market of transparency. But the immediate answer is trade measures, more frequent collection by the Secretariat, and proactive supply by member countries. Yeah.
Thank you very much. You have the wonderful example of Simon Evidence Global Trade Alert in that respect. Two questions here from Anabel Gonzalez. Do you think that the US-China conflict will impact the selection of the Director General? And both Anabel and Carlos Primo Braga pose the same question in terms of how would you handle the confrontation between the United States and China? Yeah. Please keep in mind that we're running out of time. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Anabel. Thank you, Carlos, for asking pretty much the most difficult question. I mean, we have lots of crises in the WTO. We could talk about the appellate body. We could talk about special and differential treatment. But I think all of those are relatively solvable, can be dealt with. The United States-China relationship is really the core difficult issue. And within that issue, the question of subsidies. I really believe that certainly China needs to move on many fronts. China needs to move. I pretty much hear almost a consensus -1 in the system that there are issues of transparency with China and so on. Most countries, our countries, want to work with China, very fond of work with China, investment and trade, but at the same time, everybody says there are difficulties. So China needs to be understanding of all this and respond. At the same time, the expectations that China will change its development model all of a sudden, because there are claims coming from the WTO, perhaps is not realistic. This is, again, doubly a member-driven issue. So members are to negotiate, and whatever the United States, European Union, Japan, who are working on some of these issues, can get China to negotiate, be my guest. They will be supported, and I will be with them to support them. But my expectation is that China may well not want to change dramatically its system. For example, the extent of participation of the government in the economy. China, I moved to China in 2007, to Hong Kong, when China was very much reforming. And I created a research project, policy research, with the biggest research grant ever in Hong Kong, from 4 universities, looking into China's policies in finance and in trade. And it was very much moving, but this was arrested after the Great Crisis. And since then, they have developed a different approach centered on the Belt and Road Initiative and other things. I cannot see China all of a sudden surrendering. And if the insistence is for that to happen, I think we are in for a major, perhaps disappointment and major trouble. I repeat, China needs to be responsive and to respond to the claims by 163 members maybe, or at least lots and lots of members. But perhaps the other side of the table needs to also negotiate and see, perhaps changing the economic model is not the most essential need. China can keep its state-owned enterprises, but we need a lot more transparency. And that's why I mentioned earlier that transparency is a huge subject that perhaps should keep us very busy. I think through a good in-depth examination and maybe negotiations on transparency, in this case, transparency on the working of the price mechanism, would be perhaps a balanced midpoint from which to tackle the worst problems in that relationship, so that people know how the prices operate, people can measure, observe where implicit subsidies are alleged to exist, and you can use the weaponry of the WTO, dispute settlement and all the rest to address the problems without having to go through other more fundamental changes or creating new obligations or creating new disciplines that China has said will not accept. So I would be expecting, and I didn't say looking for, I said expecting some negotiation in the middle of the road solution where China does give satisfaction to the claims from many countries. But what exactly is that? It'll have to be worked out by the major players talking with China, and I will be there to support. That's my response on that. They're very difficult question.
Thank you. Paulina Nazal makes the point that the important achievements of the multilateral trade in the system over the years have not necessarily reached connected to the daily problems of people in our societies. And some people think that this is part of the problem today in terms of the lack of credibility of the WTO in civil society and in business, private sector. So the connection between the WTO, civil society, private sector, the question is, what would you plan to do about it?
Well,
over to you.
Let me say three things very quickly. One, there has to be, as there used to be, and there would be with me, a lot more attention to society, a lot more emphasis on communication, on presence in debates with the private sector, because the reputation of the WTO is central to its success. So a good chunk would have to be putting more emphasis on being present where the debates take place. Davos, for example, but lots of smaller versions of Davos that happen all over the world. Secondly, I certainly believe that since the WTO was created, it's not only WTO that was created. More or less at the same time came the age of devotion to free markets. I believe in open trade, but free market unrestrained, I believe, I can, as an economist, I see why it can lead, or it does lead to increased concentration of income, because technology makes it perfectly feasible to sell from Chile to Korea or from Korea to Chile. And that favors big scale. So that favors the big enterprises. So if you look at any sector in the economy and you ask globally or in your country or in my country, any of them, you ask how many companies represent the top 10% of economic activity in that sector, I assure you that the number of companies has been shrinking from 30 years ago in 2010 and now. So there's a continuing concentration of production, continuing concentration of income, which are natural, but we don't have to just cross our arms. It is for governments to take actions. So my second response is that it is for governments to take decided action against concentration, protection of the poor, education policies, expenditure policies. But at the same time, in the trade arena, there are many things we can do, this is my third point, to respond to society. One of them, strictly within trade, is maybe, I just put it as one question you didn't ask, if there's anything that I would learn from the major agreement I just negotiated with the United States, the new NAFTA. And well, the NAFTA has a beautiful chapter, a whole chapter on small and medium enterprises. It was what Mexico called for, but the United States and Canada responded eagerly, because in all three countries, the problem of concentration is unacceptable. So we have created a chapter where you create policy space for policies to facilitate for all the small companies in a sector. A perfect example from Mexico is the shoe industry, which is very concentrated even geographically. Sector, you can create mechanisms for them to borrow on a syndicated basis. And by doing that, face lower rate of interest as the big enterprises face, or to purchase on a collective basis and therefore have more market power as big firms have, or to sell on a collective basis, even creating collective brands, a single brand with 50 companies behind. So all these things should be possible, face regulatory problems most of the time, and we have created a chapter to facilitate support. So that's one thing that I would hope maybe we discuss this kind of idea, but also other ways of serving society, For example, the environment. I don't see how we can continue to close the door 100% on the environment. I would continue to be very worried about areas of trade and environment that will lend themselves to protectionism. And you know that I defended successfully my country on what was perhaps the first ever major trade and environment dispute in GATT. So I am very sensitive to that. But there are other things concerning the green economy and trade, where we can think of win-win approaches, where we can think of agreeing on the creation of incentives collectively sanctified, collectively approved, incentives for better behavior against the green economy, domestically and trade-wise. So that's my third response on responding to the preoccupations of the public at large.
Very much, Jesus. We are running out of time. I have many questions. I will probably not be able to ask all the questions of you, but it just shows a lot of interest from our friends attending the session. An easy question from Mario Matos. It can only be easy if Mario Matos is asking the question, but anyway. Some experts say that the principle of non-discrimination, both national treatment and most favored nation, is at the heart of the current WTO crisis. He says everyone is discriminated, some legally through free trade agreements and other through unilateral measures. What are your views?
Well, that's probably right. And whoever is not discriminating, many are wanting to discriminate more. That's another angle. But we have to be extremely firm on that. It is the foundation of the system. From the beginning, our forefathers, among them Julio Lacarte, who was one of the people drafting the GATT, in their wisdom, created two main exceptions, which were free trade areas and preferences. Preferences, I think, need to be shrinking as time passes, as countries become stronger. You have not raised that question, but I would simply be more pragmatic on special and differential treatment. So that form of discrimination could probably fall, not for Bolivia or Honduras or Angola, but maybe for Brazil and for Chile and for Mexico. Not in every sector, but a little bit of a negotiation approach. What SDT do you need, as was done with the trade facilitation agreement? So that's one aspect of discrimination. Regional discrimination, I think, worries me less, because regional agreements, when you and I were in that system, were extremely distortionary, quite often excluding agriculture, excluding something else. If we didn't have the WTO, I assure you, the recent agreement with the United States, they would have said the car industry is out. And Mexico would have said, what? But the car industry is out. It is thanks to the WTO that this kind of thing doesn't happen. So if the only form of discrimination is covering substantially all trade and going all the way, it's okay with me. It's a way to disseminate the culture of open trade, and then you become better members of the WTO. That continues to be absolutely essential. A third form of discrimination are the plurilaterals. And the plurilaterals, again, I welcome, provided they are open to anybody and preferably big. I just think historically, what would be the history, back to the history, the last 50 years of the system, if we had not had the flexibility in the 70s to create the Tokyo Round codes? We might perhaps now be fighting over incredible things much more backward than we have. In the 70s, we created new rules that were necessary, among 12 or 20. In the 90s, we made them same level playing field for everybody. Now we are again opening the path in a plurilateral way. Do it as long as it is open to anybody who wants to join. So I think discrimination, but discrimination of the arbitrary kind, let's be very forceful against. Absolutely.
Thank you. And related to that, there's a question about what are your views on special differential treatment and the possibility of graduating developing countries as has been proposed by the United States. What are your views?
Well, I already began to refer to it. So I think it's a bad idea to think of saying a country moves from this basket to this other basket, a reclassification. Maybe it's obvious that Singapore should move because Singapore, depending on the week of the year that you look at exchange rates, Singapore might be the richest country in the world, okay? But then you come to Korea, and then you begin to move down. I am convinced, as I said before, that countries like Chile, Brazil, or Mexico should not have the same access to special differential treatment as Honduras or Angola. I believe that. But at the same time, to reclassify them would be a very painful exercise that will take just about as much as the Doha round, because it has to be accepted. Where do you draw the line? And if Chile says no, or if Mexico says no, or if, I don't know, Peru says no, whoever, where the line may lie, will be an extremely impossible, difficult negotiation. Instead of that, I would follow the tradition of our system, which is pragmatic. There's no need to discuss this issue in the abstract. Let's come to whatever is before us. For example, the fisheries negotiation or the agriculture negotiation to come, or whatever it is, and ask, hey, Mexico, why do you want to claim across the board flexibilities? Maybe it will be established that no, Mexico should not have across the board flexibilities, but flexibilities for certain major products, maybe, for example, or Chile or Brazil. Our countries are very developed in certain respects and very backward in many other respects. That's a reality. So they are not developed, they are not developing. We are emerging markets. Emerging means that you are moving. And reclassification is not the best approach. I would think of demand, negotiation, pragmatism, essentially as was done with the trade facilitation agreement.
Thank you. I have two last questions to you. One which is closely related to what you're saying. I'd like to elaborate a little bit more on that. And the question is from Rubens Barbosa.
I saw him and it was nice to see him after many years.
Okay, and it says, what are your views on the US-Brazil proposal that non-market economy should not be accepted as WTO member?
Well, again, I think it's very extreme to think of excluding a member. First of all, you have to have consensus on that among those that you want as members. Maybe some of them feel otherwise. So it'll be a very divisive plan or intention. And even if you could achieve it cleanly, even if you could say, okay, China, you are out. We are creating a new organization called WTOM, M for minus, or minus China. What is the purpose of doing that? You still would have that giant out there, still producing lots of things that many of our producers in all of our countries want to buy. Are we going to close our economies to that trade? That would be far more not advanced, far more radical is a word, than anything being considered now. And if you don't do that, then you will be trading with an entity that is not in the organization, no disciplines. I think the thing to do with China is to engage them, I certainly understand and agree and assert that there have been lots of issues, as I said, when we began a few minutes ago. But the thing to do is to confront them. Most of the issues being raised about them are violations of their obligations. That's the claim I constantly hear. China has not stood by its commitments. Well, if that is so, that's what dispute settlement is for. Maybe we don't know enough about what they do. Well, that's what better transparency would help us to do. So more transparency to be able to look and to measure and strong dispute settlement system to be able to deal with that. China has had, I believe, upwards of 44 disputes against China since they came in 19 years ago. That means 2.3 disputes per year. And if each dispute lasts for several years, then it's 5-8 disputes going on at any point in time. That's quite a lot. And maybe there should be more. So we should engage with China. If there is a problem, engage them rather than close the door in front of you. Because closing the door will be like putting your hand against the wind. You're not going to stop the wind.
Thank you, Jesus. And lastly, and again, I apologize, I will not be able to deal with all the questions. But the two sets of questions which are somewhat similar. William Ellers asked, what would be your priorities in the first 3 months as Director General? And Roberto Celli asked the questions of what would be the ideal MC12, the 12th Ministerial Conference agenda. And William Ellers adds to that, what do we need to do to restore the full functioning of the dispute settlement system?
Sorry, I was making a note. What did you say at the end about dispute settlement? What is the question?
What do we need to do to restore the full functioning of the dispute settlement system?
Okay, so these are two very different and probably the most important questions. These are the two top items on the agenda, alongside COVID whenever we come out of COVID. But those are the two, negotiations and the appellate point. On negotiations, my intention would be to work with governments to do everything I can to make sure that what is committed now happens or even better. So the fisheries negotiations are supposed to finish by the end of the year. Well, let's do everything possible to make them finish by the end of the year, or within, as I said in my presentation to the council, within my first 100 days. I cannot commit to end of the year if I start on 1st December and the negotiations have not made enough progress. But certainly to handle them with enough energy along the lines of what I said. Things are going generally well. There are some blockages, some ministers that have been grandstanding, a lot of that. We need to really push the consensus forward, almost mold the concept of consensus, use the concept that we used to use a lot of emerging consensus. So isolated blockages should really be very well justified, very well justified. And if not, I will be there to ask what is going on, Mr. Minister. So I very much hope that those 4 negotiations, the fisheries and the 3 pluries, the fishery will finish with a few months, end of the year or very soon. The other 3 will hopefully finish by MC12, if MC12 happens, or will be very advanced, but we need to agree on an agenda. So negotiations is not something that you repair from black to white, like switching on the light. Negotiations, you need to take a step, then 2 steps in the same time as the first step, and then 5 in the same time as 2. So you begin to move on a regular basis. So that's what I would see happening. Now, which areas for negotiations? The only one that I am convinced is a must is agriculture, because agriculture it's in the agreement that there will be periodic negotiations. Agriculture was one of the 2 main areas for developing countries that took obligations and trips and all that on a one-off basis, with SDT if you want, but on a one-off basis, whereas agriculture was to be a sausage machine, giving you slices all the time. And that has stopped. So agriculture, without much doubt, I would hope. Now, other areas that seem to me to be ripe for consideration, but I will have to consult and see which ones do we try to move forward, to have agendas agreed in Nur Sultan, if we go there. I've been in Nur Sultan in the middle of winter for 3 weeks. It was wonderful. It's the coldest capital in the world. It was called Astana. So the other areas that I think are almost ripe Investment, we are having investment facilitation. We can go further to investment issues, difficult to separate from trade. Competition, which to me is a must to begin to take away some of the pressure from anti-dumping. That is a very difficult area and will always be because it is so arbitrary. Competition is the right way to do things, but it requires a lot more cooperation than has been possible between authorities around the world. So agriculture, investment, competition, then hopefully an important item to meet the public's demands, as I said before, on green economy and trade, to find activities or policy that we can identify that will be win-win, not rules to create protectionism behind trade. These are my views. It's all for members. And then finally, maybe issues on transparency, not necessarily those between the United States and China. That will be a huge item between them. Maybe they will go beyond transparency. They will go to a full negotiation as being planned by Japan, European Union, and the United States. That I take as a separate entity. But transparency on trade issues certainly needs to be moved forward, which is very much the Japanese or part of the Japanese proposal. So that's my vision of what happens between now and the ministerial on negotiations. On the appellate body, I believe I've been reading a lot. I've been spending half of my time the last several months trying to understand what's going on, where do we come from? And the more I have read, the more I have confirmed myself that nobody, certainly not the United States and nobody else, has been making any complaints that amount to any changes in the DSU, in the dispute settlement understanding. All the problems are about behavior by the appellate body. And not only that, the issues raised by the Americans on the appellate body are shared by many countries. Not necessarily all of them, but many of them, a number of the issues, including the Europeans, including Mexico at some point, including Pakistan, even though these countries are in the MPIA. So they don't like the medicine applied by the United States on the appellate body, but they share the diagnostic, the same sickness, different medicine. So everybody feels that the DSU is not the problem is behavior and that there have been issues with the appellate body. So what we miss is what we, the negotiators 26 years ago, failed to create. And I apologize for that. We didn't see it coming, which is an explicit mechanism for the DSB, which is the maximum authority on disputes, to supervise the AB. It is a supervisor, and the AB is the supervisee. But the supervisee is autonomous, and it has to be autonomous on individual cases. So how do you square the circle of supervising an entity that is autonomous? The answer is not on individual cases, only on generic trends. And for that, you need to create a mechanism that we didn't create. The Walker principles are wonderful, but they don't go into this. In the last of the principles, the sixth principle, David Walker mentions only in passing that we need to develop the oversight approach by the DSB or something like that. Well, that's exactly the key trick. So I've been reading proposals. There are things that, that Terry Stewart has written, things that Jennifer Hillman has written, other people, and I think what we need, what I would float as an idea, not a proposal, because it's not for me to propose as DG, it's for members, but as an idea to see if Chile will pick it up and propose it, or somebody else, is, for example, to create under the DSB, for the DSB to pass a decision, not change in the DSU, a decision to create an appellate body oversight committee. And that oversight committee will consist of a number of ambassadors, maybe 5, maybe some legal experts appointed by the DSB or that the 5 ambassadors are allowed to co-opt 3 big lawyers, something like that, with all the sensitivities of regional representation, whatever you want, excluding any country that had an appeal in the previous period, for example, 2 years, and to have these guys examine the work of the appellate body. And if there are departures from the DSU, bring it to the departures from DSU, bring it to DSB, and the DSB will pass a decision or will take whatever action. If you do that, and some other things that I have in mind, I will not take your time on rotation of legal experts. If you do that, I don't see how anybody would feel that the appellate body will not come back to the fold and apply the agreements as it is supposed to do. So with that, I very much hope that within 100 days, we can fix that.
Jesus, thank you very much. We have gone over our allocated time. We have abused your time. We are extremely grateful. I think participants have really grilled you with questions, and you've been very frank and open in your replies. And thank you very much for that. I hope this was helpful. I again apologize because we have not had the time to pose some other questions that have come through in the chat to you. Having said that, I want to reiterate our thanks and to wish you well in your campaign. And to our friends, I would just like to say, have a nice day, bon dia, and buenos días a todos. And thank you very much. And with this, I think we can close our session.
Let me just say two words very quickly. One is that I repeat, in case I didn't qualify it before and after every sentence, but before and after every sentence, I should have qualified. It's meant that way, that my ideas of what I would bring to the table would always be respecting the decision of members on the small things and on the big things. Even the biggest things. If members want to go one way, I'll go along. I'll argue my case, but go along. Secondly, I just want to say that I am absolutely open for any one of you to please contact me. Fernando de Mateo, Alejandro Jara can give you my coordinates. I'll be delighted to hear from you if you have any further questions. And thirdly, I need your help. I hope you will stay firm, insisting that this is decided on the basis of merit. I don't claim exclusivity to merit, but make the decision on that basis, please, and not alien political considerations. I am absolutely a radical myself in my office on inclusiveness. My second year in the negotiations with the United States were 3 women, and the same will be true for the WTO, something similar. But right now, what the system needs is the most suitable pair of hands. And I believe I can offer that, but it's for you to decide. Thank you very much, Alejandro, and everybody. Great to see many familiar faces. Goodbye.
Thank you, Jesus.
Mil gracias.
Thank you very much.
Jesus.
Bye-bye. Gustavo Vega, muy bien. Salud, Gustavo.
Saludos, Alejandro, saludos a todos. Matus, Javier, etcétera.
Hasta luego todos.
Hasta luego.
Hasta luego.
Hasta luego.
Mil gracias.
Embajador Villalobos.
Árbitro, ¿cómo estás? Muchas felicidades.
Muy bien, felicidades. Muy contento de ser colega de Mateo.
Ya se me olvidó el nombre, dice, muy contento.
No, la verdad, un gusto que quedaran los dos en la lista.
Así es. Muchas gracias.
Gracias.
Un gran abrazo a todos.
Un abrazote
Okay.
a todos.
Buenos días.
Jonathan Fried.
Jonathan Fried.
Hey, Jonathan, how are you?
Jonathan.
He's not responding.
No.
He's
He
too
has,
shy.
No, he has
Jonathan.
problems with technology.
Oh.
He doesn't like you.
Right.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, all.
Mario.
Bye, thank you.
Gracias,
Bye-bye, Maria. Thank you
María.
very much.
Adiós, Fernando.
Nos vemos, muchas gracias.
Un abrazo. Hasta luego.
Dios.
Gracias.